Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the first of two panels on the theme of urban Muslimness. I'm really excited to chair this event. We're joined by such outstanding scholars here today. It promises to be a really engaging and fascinating session. With us today, we have Dr. Amani Hassani, we have Dr. Professor Chris Allen, indeed, and we have Dr. Kawtar Najib joining us, and also Professor Salman Sayyid will be joining us a little later. So the various papers we're looking at today are all engaging with this question, this theme of urban Muslimness and the core questions that we have inside there. Now, I don't want to waste too much time. I want us to get straight into the papers as soon as we can. So, without further ado, I want to introduce you to Professor Chris Allen from the University of Leicester. Hi, Chris. How are you?
Hi, James. Cheers. Thanks. It's actually still only doctor. I'd love
Well,
to say professor, but
that's fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I'll call you professor anyway. So Dr. Chris Allen is going to give his paper, which is titled "Young Brummy and Muslim Problematized Identity in the Problematized City." Chris.
Cheers, James. Thanks so much, and thanks to all the organisers actually for inviting me to speak at the event tonight. It's a fantastic opportunity to share some of my research. I'm going to just give you a quick kind of overview of the kind of the kind of start of the research. I'm going to use some slides, as you can probably already see. In terms of giving you some background, I'm not just going to read from those. There's going to be some quotes on there, some of the things that young Muslims in Birmingham kind of shared with us, and you'll be able to read those. Just to give you a little bit of background, I mean, I do have to say that even though I'm at the University of Leicester, at the moment, the research for this was funded by the University of Birmingham as part of the Birmingham's Muslims project. You can see some information there. We had a number of strands, but there's a strand that this one came from was really the identity strand, where we was looking at kind of like how do Muslims identify and within the city of Birmingham, and what is their relationship, what is the city's Muslim communities, what is their relationship with the city and those around it. And you can see that the research here that I'm going to be showing it has come from 125 participants, male and female, all between the age of 18 to 25. So I want to kind of start really by kind of talking about the problematized city, and why is Birmingham a problem, or why is Birmingham a problem in the eyes to some? Well, I've put on here kind of a few of the reasons why, and we can probably start just right of centre there with the prevent strategy. And back in 2007, Birmingham was one of the first places where, when it was prior to prevent, and it was called the PVE Pathfinder program, and Birmingham was one of the cities where it was identified that Muslims in the city in particular may become vulnerable to extremist ideologies. And so there was amount of money being invested there, and then obviously from that came the prevent strategy in its kind of subsequent iterations. But Birmingham was one of those first cities where it was kind of identified by government that this may be an issue in terms of extremism, and with that, if the strategy is correct, the movement then towards terrorism. And then we kind of move down to the bottom right, and we have there the surveillance cameras. And so we have there in 2010 over 200 cameras kind of erected almost overnight. Some CCTV, some ANPR, the automatic number plate recognition cameras, largely put around two areas in the city. Initially, it was said that those cameras were there for to kind of reduce crime. And then a colleague of mine, Arshad Isikji from the University of Birmingham, began to map this, and we realised that this was around two of the most densely populated Muslim areas. And then, whilst the government and West Midlands Police had originally said that this was for trying to reduce crime, what then comes out is actually that the money is there from kind of counter-terrorism money, and these were funded on the basis of counter-terrorism, and subsequently those cameras were removed from there. 3 years later, we have the top left, and we have the allegations of Operation Trojan Horse, and we have the, as it says there, the jihadist plot to take over city schools. Well, subsequent investigations showed there was no plot whatsoever at all of taking over schools, that these were schools where the majority of the population were from Muslim families. And actually what you saw was that, within the kind of changes that had been occurring within those schools was actually serving the local community. There wasn't no takeover, there was no allegations. But of course, what we see there from that is this idea that you start to get this idea that, there's this no smoke without fire. You start to begin to see this. I'm going to skip over this Steve Emerson in the middle for the moment, and go to the kind of top right and bottom left. And in 2017, when Khaled Massoud, drove from Birmingham to Westminster Bridge and undertook the kind of terrorist attack of the car ramming, and then trying to get into the House of Parliament, suddenly the fact that the spotlight came back onto Birmingham again. You can see there, how did it become the jihadi capital of Britain? And see that, why has Birmingham become such a breeding ground for British-born terror? And of course, 2 years prior to that, we have the Steve Emerson, the Fox News expert, who said that Birmingham is a city where they are totally Muslim, where non-Muslims simply don't go in. So that's really the problematized city. And as I say, one of the legacy of these has been this idea that actually there's no smoke without fire. And when you look at the city, when it's looked at externally, when it's been attributed, what you see is that the fact that Birmingham is seen to be a problem. Birmingham is seen to be a problem. And why? Well, when we look at that, we can see that the quick assumption is that Birmingham is a problem because of its Muslim communities in no city. The Muslim communities in Birmingham are a problem, and that makes Birmingham a problematized city. And so one of the things we wanted to do with this was we wanted to kind of like try and find out a little bit more about how do we, how has this impacted, kind of Muslims in the city? And then you can see some statistics around. Some of those obviously are a little bit out of date now because we're waiting for the new census figures to come there. But you can see there that roughly that when we see there that just over a quarter of the city's population, probably more nowadays, is is Muslim. We can see that that's disproportionately higher than the rest of England and Wales. We also see that actually, sort of Birmingham is the youngest demographic of all major cities in Europe. And also that, again, that is reflected onto the young Muslim population as well. And then we have, of course, like this, 70% of the city's Muslims live in 7 of the most deprived wards as well. And so I won't go through all of those, but you can see there that some of the issues there. And so as a city, Muslims are beginning to, will eventually become more and more synonymous with Birmingham. And if the Muslim communities are seen to be a problem and are problematized, then of course this is going to continue to be problematized with the city as well. And I will just say that most of this is from an externally perceived viewpoint around the city as well. So when we were trying to engage with young Muslims in the city, we were trying to engage with them through these lenses of identity and belonging, because they're nice kind of academic and kind of concepts that non-academics kind of understand as well, so we can kind of draw some kind of like some findings from there. And one of the things that we tried to do was we tried to use these to explore the relationship. Do those young Muslims see themselves being problematized? Do they see themselves being part of Birmingham? Are they problematized? Do they see the city being problematized? And we have kind of like those 3 kind of breakdowns. We saw this kind of come out in 3 ways: the abstract city, Muslim areas, and the city centre. In the first one, what we saw was when we started talking to young Muslims, that there was very much an acceptance that we are Brummy. Brummy, if you don't know, is a colloquial term for someone who comes from Birmingham. So this is the idea that actually we are Brummies. We are part of the city. Birmingham is a city where Muslims live, where Muslims can be Muslims. And what was interesting with this as well was that, they would refer to themselves as being Brummy Muslims, Brummies, Interesting as well that there was kind of like, this idea that actually they would prefer to be called Brummy or identified as Brummy Muslims rather than British Muslims. And some of the kind of nuance of that kind of, I don't really have time to go into at this moment. But one of the things that we saw there was this idea that actually they were very comfortable with this. What was also interesting as well is when you look at issues around kind of like notions of home and the belonging and so on, what you see is that there tends to be something of an emotional bond there. And actually, when the young Muslims we were engaging with kind of spoke about Birmingham as a city, they spoke about it as being home, and some of the quotes there you can see, reflect this. But it was almost it was a pragmatic relationship. It was a pragmatic identification. And so, kind of going beyond those kind of academic definitions where we talk about an emotional bond, where we talk about a kind of warmth, where we talk about these kind of things. As a city, yes, they were happy to be called, Brummies. Yes, they identified with the city, but actually it became almost a kind of cold thing. It didn't really feel too much around something where that there was an expression of feelings or emotion within that. And then we got on to kind of talking about, and this was how they were referred to by the participants, was the Muslim areas. Now, I think one of the things that we need to remember is that, I don't want to go down the Steve Emerson route and say, well, we have Muslim areas where you can't go. I mean, this is very, very different. One of the things that if you know Birmingham at all, historically, there's been areas which have been designated by their ethnicity. And one example, is that the area of Digbeth, if any of you know this, used to be known as an Irish area. And so, of course, what we see there is that we see, again, like this tradition. And Wrexham Moore, obviously, with their kind of groundbreaking sociological study back in 1967, spoke about how back then, 50 years ago, what you saw was that ethnic minority communities clustered together around kind of economic issues and so on. Now, when we start talking about the Muslim areas, and this, as I say, this our participants kind of spoke about them. This is where we saw the warmth. This is where we saw that emotion. This is where that kind of emotional bond began to come through. And I've read to my good friend and former colleague Arshad Easat-Daas, he spoke about this kind of an idealism, a kind of whimsy around kind of like a sense of belonging, and that was definitely there. And you can see that. And just to highlight that, the second quote. I have everything I'd ever need right here on my doorstep. I love this place. Maybe Birmingham a tourist board should take some of this on board, and kind of use some of these quotes there. But what you saw was this kind of like, it was idyllic. It was kind of idealistic. It was kind of like, very, very warm. It was emotion. And this came out, through, people talking about these Muslim areas around the city. It's where they grew up. It's where they went to school, where their friends were, their family, And one of the things that really came through with this was this notion of being safe. And when you see in the final kind of theme of this was that there was this real balance between kind of like safe and kind of safety and risk as well. And these Muslim areas were where the young Muslims felt themselves safe. That's where they felt at home. And it's interesting that kind of when we talk about the abstract city, here we see this kind of the emotional bond, and that was really much around home. So we can narrow down to actually where those emotional bonds kind of lie. And then we get into the city centres, and one of the things that's interesting is that if you look back at the work of Paul Gilroy, and look at this, and he talks about this idea around kind of convivial multiculturalism, and the urban city centre spaces were the spaces where, kind of like convivial multiculturalism or multiculture was most evident, where people just learn to rub along alongside each other, getting on in those spaces, and that those spaces and the diversity of those urban city centres were actually kind of what negated those notions of difference. Now, what we see here is that, in the almost a counterbalance of the kind of idea around kind of the safety of those Muslim areas is that we now see this kind of shift. And so young Muslims they don't really see these kind of the city centres as these places of convivial multiculture. They don't see them as spaces of being safe. And what they see them is areas of risk, and they see them as being maybe targeted by the general public in terms of Islamophobia, or targeted by the police in terms of securitization. And so what we saw as well was there was this kind of talking around kind of an acute awareness of their identity, a kind of internalization of kind of that problematized city, and also the problematized communities within those. And young people talking about, not wanting to wear a rucksack, not wanting to look at kind of anything that was too Islamic on their phone when they was on public transport and so on. And so what we see a real shift away from the kind of Gilroy's kind of like, observations around this kind of the spaces of multiculture, to those city centres now being the spaces where there was an element of risk, and there was more risk before. Which brings us on to the conclusions. I realise I'm coming very close to my time limit, but I wanted to kind of draw some of these out. And one of the things we saw was that, yes, there was this kind of clear identification with Birmingham. Home was understood in a number of different ways. It could be kind of cold and abstract, or it could be kind of warm and kind of idealistic as well. But actually, there was no element of problematization around being identifying with the city, being identified with the problematized city. And so what we saw was that actually we see this idea that actually the shared identity that kind of came through of being a young Brahmi Muslim was very different to, say, what the kind of problematized identity that would maybe be externally perceived or understood or even imposed. And I think that that's one of the things that we can say with that, is that those problematized identities are externally imposed. But the one thing we do see is that the drip feed of this problematization kind of discourse really has begun to kind of impact maybe on, not in terms of their behavior, not in terms of their identity, but more in terms of the way in which it conjures feelings. So within those problematized spaces, young Brahmi Muslims can kind of conjure feelings of kind of security and being safe, but at the same time insecurity and being unsafe as well. And I think that one of the things that we can draw from that is that problematization has been disruptive, but in terms of their identity and their performance of their identity across the entirety of that problematized kind of city space. But actually, when we come down to it, the identity of those young Brahmi Muslims in themselves is not in any way problematic in terms of them or in terms of those around them. Thanks very much for that. I'll just quickly put some contact details up there, and I look forward to having any questions in the Q&A. Thanks very much.
It's wonderful. Thanks, Chris. Really, really fascinating stuff, and I can't wait to get into the Q&A later on and the panel discussion, which brings me to a reminder that we will have a Q&A after the papers have been delivered, and you can put some comments, if you like, in the comment section there, which you'll see on your screen. So if you have any questions, please do, by all means, pop them in there, and we'll hope to discuss them a little later. I want to move on to the next paper now, that is from Dr. Amani Hassani. Amani will be speaking to her paper, which is titled Unfixing Racialized Space, Cartographies of Racialization and Danish Muslims' Spatial Narratives. Amani, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to try to put my slide up. There. So yeah, thank you, James. And as you just mentioned, the title of my paper today is Unfixing Racialized Spaces, Cartographies of Racialization and Danish Muslim Spatial Narratives. So what I want to do in this paper or this presentation is to look at how Muslims living in Copenhagen challenge racialized spaces through convivial narratives, spatial narratives. Now here I use conviviality, really drawing on Paul Gilroy that Chris Allen just briefly mentioned, drawing on his conceptualization of conviviality as this alternative concept to understanding multicultural cosmopolitanism. So what Gilroy does with this idea of conviviality is to say that convivial urban life, or the good urban life of living in diversity, is intrinsically connected to structures of nationalism and racism. And this is where I found the narratives of the young people I spoke to really connect really well with this idea of conviviality, as you can never separate it from the nation state and the way that nationalism and racism kind of trickle down from political discourse and policies down to everyday life. So based on ethnographic analysis, I suggest that these young people I spoke to, their narratives demonstrate how experiences of racialization and othering coexist with this convivial urban life. I draw on 3 different narratives that I'll get into a little bit later. And here I argue that convivial narratives among Muslims can be read as a tactic to challenge powerful structures that seek to exclude, marginalize, and problematize racialized Muslims in Denmark. Now, just a small note about Denmark as the context. There's very limited scholarship on how Muslims in Denmark experience racialization, not to mention racism and Islamophobia. And in fact, racism in Denmark is often understood as individual biases, very rarely connected to, very rarely understood as a structural phenomenon of upholding racial hierarchies and power dynamics. So what I want to kind of emphasize and argue is that there's a value in expanding the scholarly conversation on race and space to include experiences of racialized others in smaller countries such as Denmark, they've upheld an international image of being an egalitarian progressive society and thereby avoided a critical international gaze into how its nationalist and often, might I add, racist structures affect its racialized population. Yeah, so I want to just spend a few moments here on this slide. This is a map of, or a screenshot of a city map of Copenhagen. And there's an added filter here. This is provided by the Copenhagen municipality. There's an added filter depicting where non-Western residents reside in the city. And this is from the year 2015. So what's important to understand here is that, so non-Western, for people who don't know the Danish context, is often used as a catch-all phrase to define people of color in Denmark that are often presumed to be Muslim. And what's important to note here is that this map is not about cultural diversity or the ethnic makeup of the city. And if it was about cultural diversity, non-Western is a category that would obscure the cultural, linguistic, and social diversity of residents who are not white. Rather, what this municipality map focuses on is social economic factors. It has other filters that I haven't included on this map that measure levels of socioeconomic disparity in these different neighborhoods, including unemployment rates, low income levels, feelings of safety in these different parts of the city. Now, all these factors become part of the racialization of Copenhagen spaces by adding non-Western as one of the markers to measure socioeconomic levels. This is what I would argue, because the racial ascription becomes a way of differentiating between white, supposedly affluent space, marked in yellow or light yellow, and non-white, supposedly deprived space, marked in red. So as you can see from this map, the red is over 18% minorities living in those areas. So here we see a class-based spatial analysis of Copenhagen becoming intertwined with a racial analysis. Hence why I would argue this is the racialization of space in maps or illustrated through maps. So just a note on the way this map is depicted. I can easily read this map because I was born and raised in Copenhagen and I know how to navigate these spaces. So did the young Muslims who participated in my research. They navigated this map in their everyday life without very much self-consciousness. They may have lived in the red parts of the map and studied, worked, and socialized in the yellow part, or vice versa. They moved seamlessly through these spaces. They were perceived to be rooted in some, while perceived to invade others. But they all found different ways of demonstrating the social meaning they attributed to specific neighborhood, irrespective of the political stigmatization they experienced. So although they were well aware of the dominant narratives of the spaces they navigate through, the young people I spoke to and I talk about in this presentation, they seem to implicitly challenge these ideas, this map, by providing alternative spatial narratives that inscribe them into spaces that nationalist political rhetoric attempt to either erase them from or problematize their presence in. So this brings me to my first case, which is an example or a narrative provided by Iman. So Iman was a young woman whose family had lived in Denmark for over half a century. Her mom arrived when she was only 4 years old and grew up in Copenhagen in the 1970s. And she explains throughout throughout the interview I spoke to her, and she explained how her mom had a very different experience growing up in Copenhagen, because at that time, although there was an increase in labor migrants from the global south, there was very little political and public discourse vilifying Muslims and minorities. So her mom basically grew up with not the same heightened level of vilification that Iman experienced growing up in the post 9/11 Copenhagen. So now Iman grew up close to central Copenhagen, and although she grew up in a working class environment, it was a white working class neighborhood, which was low income household. There was a lot of deprivation. There's a lot of unemployment rate. The unemployment rate was high. However, it was mainly white working class struggling families living in that area. So this is very contrary to the political representation in Denmark of deprived urban neighborhoods as non-Western enclaves. So the neighborhood Iman grew up in was very much contrary to this image. But what was unique about her explanation of growing up here was that it was her childhood was colored by discrimination and racial abuse in the public spaces of where she resided and where she went to school. And this recollection had kind of really imprinted herself in her memory. She even described how she used to tell her classmates that it wasn't her choice to live in Denmark. So if her lifestyle was perceived as strange by their standards, she didn't see herself as Danish anyways. And I think there's something really significant here in her experience of political exclusion, which kind of trickles down to her everyday life, is this disengagement she felt. So she explains to me, I choose not to keep up with politics. It makes me too frustrated. Everything that is about being Danish in public space, I just don't interfere with. I keep my Danishness at home. My rye bread, my korsgård. I laugh at my Danish movies. I live in Denmark, but everything else I don't get involved in because there's no room for someone like me. And I think there's something significant here for someone whose family has lived in Denmark for over half a century, of saying that I disengage any conversation about belonging. I live here, I love living here, but I disengage from this discussion because it's not it's not a discussion on equal terms. This brings me to my next case, which was Khaled, a young man who grew up so not far from where Iman grew up, but in a red segment of Copenhagen. And many of his experiences, he grew up in a very supportive environment. Even the white people in his neighborhood were very extremely supportive of him. So there was a very different kind of feel of experiencing Copenhagen from his side. Unique about Khaled is that he was also a semi-professional athlete from a young child, and he grew up traveling internationally, representing Denmark, but also internally in Denmark. He traveled across Denmark for these sports tournaments. Throughout his narrative, it seemed particularly important for Khaled to argue for his Danishness and his Danish belonging. And this was a tendency that could be observed among a lot of my interlocutors to various degrees, emphasizing their rootedness, their belonging to spaces, to the spaces both locally and nationally, as if they're speaking against this hegemonic discourse of Muslims as strangers. It seemed that if they were not adamant about their rootedness, if they admitted a hesitation in their national loyalties, they could be plucked up from the very ground and displaced, as if the political threat of expelling the stranger was real in even the most mundane of everyday interactions. And just a side note on this, because it may sound very extreme to say it this way, but I find the ghetto policy, which came after I completed my ethnographic fieldwork in Denmark by a few years, it literally displaced displaces Muslim families in these red segments of Copenhagen. So there's a real sense of threat in the idea of being able to be displaced within their neighborhoods and detached from the neighborhoods that they feel such a strong connection to. So admitting his own difficulty with white Danes, he also noted that whenever he traveled within Denmark to compete, him and his teammates who were also Muslim would face the fact that they were often perceived to not be Danish. And I found this quote from him really telling. So this is him telling me how an experience when he was very young, when he was 9-10 years old, traveling to a town in rural Jutland. He says, it was in Esbjerg when a man with a South Jutland accent comes to me. You almost couldn't understand what he said. Then he said, you're actually good at speaking Danish. And here Khaled imitates the South Jutland dialect. And then Khaled continues. Then I said, sorry, what are you saying? And then he says, your Danish is good, all right? And I just thought, of course I speak Danish. Is there something wrong with you or what? I told him, I speak better Danish than you do. It wasn't just that experience. You met with prejudice whenever you leave the environment you're used to here in Copenhagen. Now, the comment from the man from South Jutland seemed to be, this man seemed to be complimenting Khaled on his Danish language skills. However, even as a child, Khaled was conscious of how the man's compliment, in fact, was a way to emphasize Khaled's non-whiteness as a sign of his strangeness and non-belonging. So Khaled's very creative way of countering this powerful display of racial disparity was by questioning the man's own Danishness. So this narrative, I think, by Khaled is a very important example of how hegemonic discourse, which racializes Muslims as strangers, becomes a way of racializing all spaces for young Muslims or Muslims in general. This was such a significant part of Khaled's experience whenever he left his red segment of Copenhagen. So this brings me to my last example. So this wasn't an interview. This was a walk tour I did through Copenhagen with Dania, a young 22-year-old woman who was born and raised in the rural part of Funen, which is an island in Denmark, and a very white town in Funen. She moved to Copenhagen when she started university. And so in this regard, she followed the typical stream of rural urban migrants in Denmark who moved from rural areas of Jutland and Funen to the capital for higher education and professional opportunities. Now, Dania's appreciation of Copenhagen's cultural diversity allowed her to be, and the lifestyle it allowed her became clear as she walked me through her city. Now, Dania lived in a very affluent white part of Copenhagen it's a borough next to Copenhagen called Frederiksberg. But she chose to not take me there. She took me to Nørrebro, which is the heart of culturally diverse Copenhagen. And we met at a place called Blågård Square, which was a side street to the high street of Nørrebro. Now, this part of Nørrebro has gone through massive gentrification in recent years. Trendy cafes, vintage clothing shop, really attracting particularly white Danes seeking a more authentic urban experience. So now the charm of Blågård Square is also the escape from commercialism that many people really don't like about some of the high streets in Copenhagen. Dania belonged to this segment. She's a university student, comfortable middle class, and she sought that excitement and diversity of Nørrebro, but just the right balance of trendy cafes and much less deprived areas as some other parts of Nørrebro is. So her tour was a construction of this certain version of herself. Besides being Muslim and from rural Funen, she was now also a Copenhagener, living and biking her way through Copenhagen and the urban streets of Nørrebro. So especially this charming side of Nørrebro. This brings me to my final slide and conclusion. So what we see here with Iman and Khaled's examples is how an increasingly ethno-nationalist political rhetoric trickles down from political discourse to everyday encounters. But this last case of Dania really offers an alternative narrative, one that roots Muslims as part and parcel of Copenhagen spaces. They're part of what makes Copenhagen creates the global image of Copenhagen. One of the reasons why Nørrebro, the district that she took me to, was voted the coolest neighborhood in 2021 by Time Out magazine is the presence of this diversity. They're present, these young Muslims and their diversity positions the city as multicultural, super diverse, at the same time that the city also allows them this social mobility, this class positioning as middle class young professionals. So the young people I met, the young Muslims I met, loved living in Copenhagen and its neighborhoods and eagerly identified as Copenhageners. It provided them, the city provided them with this opportunity to subvert racializing national politics and policies. Now, as a final note, it's really important to mention that living convivially in Copenhagen was a capacity that my interlocutors were able to establish because of their social mobility, because of their class position as middle-class university students and professionals. There's more to be said about this because there's in it also a way of them hoping to escape Islamophobia by enacting their middle-class positions within particularly white urban spaces. But I know I'm out of time, so I'm gonna just end it with that little comment for questioning in the Q&A if there's an interest to talk more about that. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks so much, Amani. That's fascinating. Some really, really interesting things. And I mean, we'll have a discussion later, and I encourage everybody to please add some questions and comments if you have them. We'll have plenty of time for a Q&A afterwards. The ideas around conviviality are something that are really kind of, conjure up these images of really, really kind of, I guess, troubling images. And when you frame it through this nationalist sort of perspective. So I'm looking forward to the conversation afterwards about that. And it's great to see some of the commonalities coming through with Chris's paper previously. And this kind of brings us nicely as well to Dr. Kawtar Najib's paper, which is entitled Urban and Infra-Urban Islamophobia, the Case of Paris and London. So this is our final paper, and I want to pass it over to Dr. Najib, and we'll have our Q&A afterwards. Kawtar, please.
Okay. So thank you very much. I would like to thank all the organizers for this presentation. As some may know, I am a social and urban geographer who works on Islamophobia, and this presentation gives me the opportunity to talk about the specific scale of urban and infra-urban Islamophobia in Paris and London. I've analyzed this specific scale in great details in the third chapter of my recently published book called Spatialized Islamophobia. The main purpose of this book is to show the multiscalar nature of Islamophobia and to bring an increased recognition of space and geography in Islamophobia studies. I developed the concept of spatialized Islamophobia, which basically shows that Islamophobia is everywhere and affects all spatial scales, ranging from the globe to the body. I have various chapters detailing the three main levels of scale, the global and national scale, the urban and infra-urban scale, and the embodied and emotional scale. But today I'm just going to focus on Islamophobia within the city and the neighborhood by offering some insights on what the visibility of urban Muslimness can generate in these two major European cities. Studying Muslimness in the city is particularly relevant because in Europe and even beyond, Muslim populations usually tend to live in urban spaces and to avoid rural spaces. Also in the city, everything affects everything else. People are connected to each other and they are also linked to organizations, housing, transport, and job opportunities. Therefore, the markers of Muslimness Muslimness are more visible throughout the urban sphere and can raise more concerns and even moral panics that fuel anti-Muslim rejection. Many controversies, discussions, and even laws, especially for the French case, have been motivated by the ostensible visibility of, for example, the hijab or the full face veil in the public space. Same for mosques, street prayers, and halal shops that are also at the center of urban landscape issues. Just by taking the example of mosques, or more exactly the construction of a future mosque, the chosen space for this project can generate conflictual and racist reactions. The size of the mosque can be seen as a problem, as can the height of the minaret or the audibility of calls to prayer. Likewise, for the residential areas of Muslims, they are usually regarded as dangerous, segregated areas where Muslims tend to voluntarily self-segregate and keep their distance from the rest of society. So all these negative representations raised by the visibility of urban Muslimness can encourage negative public attitudes toward Islam and Muslims. The experience of urban Islamophobia connects to a varied literature on residential segregation, ghettos, deprivation, exclusion, fears, mobility, belonging, and encounters. It can also bring out various specific types of spaces, such as the social space, the racial space, the everyday space, the perceived space, the exclusive space, etc. And it can also draw different urban patterns borrowed from urban sociology and mainly from research on spatial inequalities carried out by the Chicago School. More concretely, in Paris and London, the mapping of Islamophobia was possible thanks to geocoded data that I have collected from NGOs and the Metropolitan Police. In Paris, the center is the most affected area within the Greater Paris region. Anti-Muslim acts take place more in the Parisian center, and they decrease progressively as we move away from this center. In London, there are as many anti-Muslim acts in the inner London as there are in the outer London. But we notice even more the importance of some horizontal and vertical lines. For example, a dark horizontal line shows a worrying level of Islamophobic acts from Newham to Hounslow. In the inner London, a first cluster appears in the east in boroughs where there are several Islamic buildings as well as a large Muslim population. But there is also a second cluster in the west, in the wealthiest part of inner London, where anti-Muslim act generally occurs around major shopping and tourist areas and areas with good transport links. This brief analysis highlights two different urban patterns in Paris. Islamophobia describes a center-periphery urban model, contrasting the city center and its suburbs, while in London, it rather describes a model which takes into account transport access in its configuration. These results can be explained by the fact that Islamophobia mainly occurs in public institutions in Paris and on public transport in London. Urban Islamophobia can also be linked to other geographies and mainly to socio-economic segregation in Paris and to racial religious segregation in London. In Paris, even if there are no data on race and religion, the residential location of Muslims mainly refers to areas with a high concentration of poverty, social housing, minority groups, and ghettoization. As the maps show, these deprived areas located in the northeast do not necessarily correspond to spaces of Islamophobia. So the Parisian victims are affected beyond their residential areas and mainly in the prestigious Parisian center. In London, the maps show that Islamophobia happens both in areas with high and low Muslim populations, but the Islamophobic acts per se are not the same, and they are more prominent in public spaces when they take place in Muslim minority areas. These areas rather correspond to transit zones for Muslims because they include multiple bus stops or tube stations, as well as busy streets with a high level of pedestrian activities. Therefore, in both cities, it seems that as soon as there is a form of commuting or mobility, especially to reach the influential center, then there is an increased risk of aggression and discrimination. Clear geographical tensions operate and emphasize areas where perpetrators feel confident enough to behave antisocially. In the city, there are undoubtedly specific neighborhoods and streets where visible Muslims do not feel welcome and safe. Their ability to move safely through certain parts of the city is affected and demonstrates complex mapping systems of where they feel they can go and can bond. Their fear and anxiety can be mentally mapped and draw a geography of perceived risk, which shows that their way of accessing, engaging, and navigating the city is carefully thought out. Indeed, urban streets being sites of encounters and domination, Muslims can self-censor and feel spatially excluded from certain areas. This is what I found out after interviewing 60 victims of Islamophobia in Paris and in London in 2017-2018. The victims, especially veiled Muslim women, told me that they avoid certain neighborhoods and streets in connection with their own experiences of Islamophobia. And this obviously seriously affects and restricts their spatial mobility. First, in Paris, veiled Muslim women consciously or unconsciously avoid the center. Some explain that they have not been in central Paris for a long time because they have nothing to do there, which is quite hard to believe because central Paris offers diverse cultural activities, places of entertainment, parks and shops. And others clearly explain that they do not visit the Parisian center because they feel out of place. As Kenza, a 30-year-old French-Moroccan veiled woman, explains. Not at all. I do not go to central Paris. Not at all, at all, at all. As soon as I can avoid Paris, I avoid it. I avoid Paris because I don't feel at all in my place. I won't go there because of the staring eyes, because of the comments. There, I'm really clearly afraid of being attacked in Paris. I will not venture there. In suburban cities, they feel more accepted and more part of the landscape, in their own words. That said, these geographical tensions between the center and the suburbs seem to reduce when we zoom in on certain neighborhoods and take into account their socioeconomic status. Veiled Muslim women identify both like rich neighborhoods, both in Paris and in the suburbs, where they don't feel comfortable compared to more working class neighborhoods. In London, veiled Muslim women don't avoid privilege and central neighborhoods compared to the Parisian victims. Instead, they avoid non-diverse areas and especially predominantly white areas. They are less comfortable in these areas, and some even mention being scared. This is the case of Mina, an 18-year-old British Somali girl wearing a turban, who explains. If I'm going out and I'm in a predominantly white area, I get scared. Not scared, but you have that fear inside you. Is that person not going to treat me the same? If I were to go to workplaces such as Westminster, it's predominantly white and I wouldn't feel safe. Also, some veiled Muslim women avoid areas and streets where there is a lot of bars and pubs because they fear the othering gaze. A majority of them also avoid public transport to minimize any risk, as Nadia, a 35-year-old British South Asian woman in hijab, explains. Yes, I would drive in rather than use public transport. And I would basically be limiting how much I need to walk. With public transport, I'm slightly wary of. I'm slightly where I stand on the metro station platform. I will try to make sure that I'm not so close so that anyone can try to push me. So while reading Nadia's quote, we can notice the gravity of what urban Muslimness can generate. To avert potentially life-threatening experiences, Muslims in Paris and London have to adopt new strategies, spatial and behavioral strategies. In conclusion, I can say first that the results of the maps describing the location of anti-Muslim acts correspond to the mental map shared by the interviewees. Indeed, in Paris, for example, the perceived geographies of Islamophobia concern central and privileged areas and correspond to the real geographies of Islamophobia recorded in official statistics. Also, it is obvious that urban Muslimness can provoke spatial exclusion that questions the very presence of Muslims, or more precisely, their right to be visible and to access certain parts of the city. Their right to appear, their right to the city, and their right to centrality reveal sharp boundaries between areas. The nature of an area, as well as the specific places that it contains and the form of mobility that it generates, have a direct impact on urban and infra-urban Islamophobia. This type of Islamophobia refers to a more physical Islamophobia linked to Muslims' appearance, and this ultimately pushes them towards more familiar and more familiar spaces, such as their home neighborhoods, which represent for them a more inclusive and secure space where they can practice their Muslimness more openly. That said, I must add that some NGOs in the UK, such as MEND and its IRU, Islamophobia Response Unit, have observed during COVID-19 an increase in reports of harassment from neighbors. So Islamophobia within the city and above all within the neighborhoods definitely deserves more investigation. Thank you.
Hi, Kawtar, thanks very much. It's fascinating. The use of maps is just amazing. Looking at that with Amani's map as well, it's really fascinating stuff, and we can see the I guess the connectivity of the papers coming through very clearly there as well. That point, that quote you have from the participant who is really, definite about not at all is fascinating in itself, and really underscoring this kind of, I don't go to Central Paris. Some fascinating stuff to talk about, and indeed, and the issue around class and poverty coming through again, which is something I think we'll chat about in a few moments. Thanks, Kawtar. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Fantastic paper. I want to introduce our last speaker now, and that is Professor Salman Sayyid from the University of Leeds. Once you're ready to go there, I'll pass it over.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and slight apologies. I had a bit of an IT nightmare, which meant I wasn't able to listen to everything at one time. But I caught some of it, and so if I repeat myself or repeat what's already been said, then think of this as a kind of a reinforcement rather than just repetition of what the message of this gathering on urban Muslimness is. I want to confine my conversation, my presentation, to basically two sets of questions. The first set of questions is really to talk a little bit about Muslimness. What is the difference between Islamicate, Muslims, and Muslimness? That's the first part. And secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the very idea of the urban and what that means for the question of identity that we are really discussing about different forms of identity and different forms of vocation of particular kind of identity. So that's my general two-pointer bit that I'm going to try and do. So let's kick off. I was really, really pleased to see this conference on Muslimness because it's difficult to tell time now with COVID, but I think it must have been about 2019. I was at the House of Commons and I was talking about with some parliamentarians, and we were discussing the idea of a definition for Islamophobia, and what I and a colleague were proposing was to understand this as a type of racism that targets Muslimness. And there was a certain outburst among parliamentarians and others saying, well, what is Muslimness? Never heard of that expression. What could it possibly mean? And we try to explain this by saying, well, you have by analogy. So you have some Englishness and you have Germanness, etc. So, it would be something about the identity, but not being able to restrict it. So it was just the sense that it had never been really, they had never come across it. It didn't, and there was then some academics suggesting as well, it doesn't really exist in literature. So it's great to see, and I suppose the proliferation of the use of Muslimness. And I think it's really, really helpful category because one of the things that Muslimness does is move us away from the idea that being a Muslim is something which is consolidated and settled. And in that, I think all identities are not settled and consolidated, but nor are they in a flux. So it is really the process of which you have provisional and temporary crystallizations around subject positions, which is really the key here. And Muslimness, in a way, is constant becoming of what a Muslim subject position may be, but it doesn't itself have any particular content, and it could change. So, for example, in the case of France, we know that since the obsession with the headscarf, we have where the idea of the hijab definitely connoted Muslimness, or the veil, etc. in France. And now we have other aspects of features which are associated with being Muslim, for example, beards, length of skirts, food, etc., becoming markers of Muslimness. So in a sense, what you're always dealing with is a menu of features rather than something which is fixed and could be read constantly despite any particular situation. So I think it's good to think about Muslimness as being something which allows us to see how one can perform a Muslim identity in a particular context, how that identity or that subject position is shaped by particular circumstances, particular arrangements, and how there is identity is not simply derived theologically. So one of the challenges often happens with Muslims category is, well, who is a Muslim, who is not a Muslim? And that often becomes contested. So it's not in a way of avoiding that, but recognizing that that answer about who is a Muslim or not a Muslim and what should count as being Muslim or not is part of the flux created by Muslimness, and its settlements are these simple momentary interventions which fix that host of features to say, well, these are the three, or these are the five, of course, pillars or five instances which constitute that Muslim subjectivity at that particular moment in time. So I think from that point of view, it's quite clear to see Muslimness in this as a kind of a process rather than the focus on Muslim, which seems to be the end of a process or a consolidation in a way. So that's one framing. I think the second thing that I would want to sort of differentiate is between Muslimness and the Islamicate, and that's slightly tricky. And I think, as many of the people on this call would know, that the term Islamicate was introduced by Marshall Hodgson to deal with the phenomenon which he described, which was inspired by either by Islam or by a setting where Islamic vocabularies, Islamic practices were in place, but were not necessarily reducible to Islam understood, for example, as a religion, etc. So, for example, we use the phrase Italianate or Persianate to refer to artistic productions, that they are in the style of, but not the same as something which is Italian and something which is Italianate. So in that sense, what you have with the Islamicate is a sense of features which may be associated with cultural practices, with social practices which occur in Islamicate in particular settings, but are not necessarily derived from anywhere from Islam. So in a way, you could have Islamicate philosophy or Islamicate authors who may not be themselves Muslim. They could be Christians, they could be Jews, they could be Zoroastrians, but they're writing in idiom, an Islamicate idiom. So you have that possibility here. And I think it's important that both Islamicate and Muslimness are recognized for the important work they do in trying to see the notion of Islam and Muslim as a process rather than an essence. And that anti-essentialism that these configurations of categories bring is really, really important. And it's important not for reasons of theoretical purity or for any kind of romantic attachment to anti-essentialism, but it is important because it allows us to understand the world as it is, and it gives us a better handle on things around us. One of the fundamental conceits around the critique of anti-essentialism has always been that anti-essentialism is an innovation that undermines the order of things, that undermines how the world really is. And it's really something that was dreamt up in Paris, and then it went to America, and everyone this is a kind of a postmodern affliction, to do with people like Foucault and Derrida and their American students. And the real world is not anti-essentialist. What I'd like to suggest to you is, in fact, the world has always been anti-essentialist. It is only modernity and the kind of epistemological heritage of modernity that made it essentialist. In other words, that the quest for foundations and essences is not a product of uncovering the real situation, but is actually a product, a reflection of the imposition of modernity in both of its socio-economic and epistemological range sensibilities. So what you have is a world made by the process of modernity and coloniality together. It's important to remember that modernity had a flip side, which was coloniality. And those categories we live with, and those categories are the ones that we actually assume to be the way the world is, rather than products of particular hegemonic transmissions and hegemonic elements and impositions. In other words, that the naturalization of categories from modernity, coloniality are simply naturalizations, not a reflection of the nature or the real. So in that sense, anti-essentialism is a recovery of of what happened before we began to think only in these very particularist modernist tones. And that allows me to perhaps think a little bit more on the notion of the urban and what the urban does in this way. I don't know about you, but I just read something very recently that something like 50% of the world's population now is classified by the United Nations as being urban. And I think that's quite interesting, because the idea of the urban itself has been seen as a major transition from what was conventionally called prehistory to history. So Michael Mann, in his Sources of Social Power, talks about the city and the urban form as one of the three components which mark out that shift. And in all of these theorizations of the urban, there is a sense when the urban is described as being somehow like a container. It is something that contains, and you have diverse people and diverse things coming in there, and it's just basically this huge container of heterogeneity, etc. However, if you look at more recent scholarship, one of the things that the city does, it's not that it's a container, it's also a dissolver. It's a dissolver of other kinds of identification and other kinds of formations and other identity formations. So in a sense that, so for example, kinship ties or families or class or all of these things enter the urban and become dissolved into other kinds of identity and create other kind of identifications. So it's not a heterogeneous thing in terms of a coalition of pre-existing essential identities, but actually a reformulation of identifications, particular identifications. And in this case, I think the urban as a crucible of contemporary Muslimness is what we have to understand it. So the kind of conventional idea is this, that Muslimness is part of this modern rural to urban migration. And analog of that is the migration from the global south to the global north. And so it's basically forms of migration which determine what the Muslimness, the shape the Muslimness takes. I would like to suggest to you here is that perhaps urbanity is what is defining feature of Muslimness, in that what you have in the urban is the possibility of a Muslim identification, a basis around a shared family resemblance of Muslimness, which then holds onto the different kinds of formulations and reformulations. And in that moment, it presents the new possibility, a different kind of family shared resemblance of what it means to be Muslim. And this means that often when you have social identities which have been contained in, let's say, ethnicities, and contained in the nation state, or contained in other forms of social identities and positionalities, begin to dissolve in the urban and then are re-articulated. And in that, Muslimness emerges as that force of that re-articulation. So what that then means, that Muslimness should be seen not as a sort of a vestige of the traditional, something left over from the pre-modern, and something that we cannot, it is part to do with a kind of Europe's medieval imagination, but really as a harbinger of the future, of a post-Western future, because it allows itself to be articulated in the crucibles of the city, where it is actually, in a very critical sense, far more able, with all to be transnational, transethnic, to translate itself in across those boundaries which had already been set and established. So I think this is where I would like to suggest we think about the articulation by urban Muslimness is not simply the idea of refugees from modernity, but perhaps the vanguard of a modernity to come that is postmodern. And my final illustration would be a slightly macabre one, I suppose. One of the overarching descriptions of the Muslim has always been of the Muslim as the harbinger and a representative symbol of particularity, of something singular, etc. And often you saw this in contrast to the global, to the shining, to the Western, which was kind of universal. And perhaps what urban Muslimness is pointing to is the ability for the universal to be generated in different spaces and different places, and the capacity for Muslimness to represent and incarnate a form of universality rather than particularity, a form of universality that is critical of the last 200 years of the dominance of the national ethnic conglomerate as a way of regulating and I suppose imposing particular forms of political and social identities. So my final word is that urban Muslimness is about the future, not the vestige is of the past. And Muslimness is what is giving the urban form, post-Western urban form, its particularity, its specificity. That if you go anywhere in the world, one of the ways that you know a city is heterogeneous is by the presence of Muslimness. That becomes central to the evolution of what a city would be, a post-Western city would be. Thank you. Can't hear you, James. I'm sure you're saying wonderful things. Well, I'll pretend you're saying wonderful things.
It was the most profound. It was the most profound thing I have ever said, Salman, and I've forgotten already.
I know, and then it's been lost to history.
Yeah, I'm reminded of at the very outset of the panel. The first two papers looked at this concept of conviviality. And what strikes me there when you're talking about this universal, and for me, the idea of conviviality kind of conjures up this idea of a sort of kind of I use the term idyllic sort of national identity, yeah, and this, how problematic that is, and then coming back to this universalist approach that you're getting to this future, if you will, of what conviviality could look like, maybe, I think is or looks like, is fascinating in and of itself. Thanks so much, Salman. I really appreciate that. Yeah, welcome back. Everyone's back on screen, so I can see everybody. Thank you all for your papers. There's some fantastic points have been raised. And yeah, we have a few comments as well that I want to pop at a few people as we go through. So there've been various comments have been raised during the course of the conversation. Just to give you an idea on time, we have about 15 minutes for a general discussion on the points that have been raised. And I think there's one thing that jumps out at me, and it's maybe because of the it's something that's really kind of played in my own research in the past. It's come up in my own work, and it goes across all the papers that we've looked at, really. And this is this idea around class. and the impact of class on the experiences there. So we have a question actually from Ben, who mentioned here. He says that there are two questions I want to get to, actually. So with Ben, we have thanks Chris and Amani. You both touched on questions of conviviality and changing demography. So I wondered if you could speak more about whether or how gentrification mattered to your participants. There's another comment that goes with that as well, which is Copenhagen isn't too different from London. Dania's experience reminds me of the gentrification of Brick Lane, Shoreditch in London as well. So maybe if you could speak a little bit about that, I think it would be fascinating. And I think it spans nearly all the papers that we have here this evening. So it's a nice place to start. Amani, can I give the floor to you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Those were really great questions. I think, let me start with the last one first. I think when I did my field work, I had never actually visited Brick Lane. And then coming to London and moving to London after the fact, really it stood out to me how the gentrification you see in Brick Lane is basically what's been going on in Nørrebro. And I don't know if anyone know about Denmark. They've gotten a little bit of a bad rep from their ghetto policies, but this really came out in 2018, a couple of years after I did my field work. This idea of gentrification under racialized terms. But the difference from what you see in places like London is that it's the racialization of this gentrification is verbalized. It's explicit. Areas with more than 50% Muslim population in social housing, these social housing needs to have a redistribution of demographics. So there's a very very strong connection with the idea of class and the underclass being Muslim in this type of rhetoric. And so this idea of gentrifying certain Copenhagen spaces is very connected with the idea of moving the site of the Muslim other away from the public spaces of the nice public spaces of Copenhagen. And you kind of feel that walking through the spaces with my interlocutors. What's interesting here is, as you were mentioning, James, this idea of class really plays into this to my interlocutors' narratives a lot, because a lot of them were middle class, a lot of them were socially mobile. They may have grown up in a socially deprived area, but they were coming up the stages of society of social positioning, and so they're also very much privileged in the class sense of the word, something that many other residing in these areas, in these social housing areas nowadays, most often newer migrants, they haven't lived in Copenhagen for half a century like Iman did, you know. So they're newer migrants. They don't have the same capacity to navigate these spaces the same way my interlocutors really were able to. And so it's this idea of the gentrification of Copenhagen being connected to this neoliberalization of policies in Denmark, the erosion of the welfare state really being introduced with the fact of the Muslim other threatening the welfare state. So let's remove these welfare policies. So there's a very strong connection in policy rhetoric and political rhetoric of vilifying the Muslim to be able to neoliberalize the city. That's kind of a very short, very concise way of explaining this. There's a lot to say about it, but those two questions really hit the nail on the head in terms of speaking about Copenhagen as a racialized space through political dynamics and how this is navigated by these young Muslims.
Kawtar, Chris, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, just in what's really interesting in Birmingham is that, and I mentioned that, you know, over 70% of the city's Muslim population lives in the 7 most deprived wards in the city. And what you have in Birmingham is you have a kind of city centre, and then you have a ring of kind of poverty, which is kind of around the city centre, and then you get into the kind of more of the suburbs where, you know, the levels of deprivation, you know, kind of are much more in pockets. But there's, you know, some of the areas there are much more affluent. And it's really interesting listening to Amani and some of the things she was talking about around gentrification, because what we've seen is that, you know, what I would say in Birmingham is that, you know, the whole of the city centre is, you know, very much under change, you know, being kind of attempts of being rebranded, attempts of being a different type of Birmingham. And I think that one of the things that's been really interesting is when you look at that ring of poverty, where, you know, there you would have seen historically, you would have seen the migrant communities, whether that was from the Indian subcontinent, whether that was from the Caribbean, or whether that was from Ireland, and you would see those kind of like those there. What's really interesting is that the areas such as where the Irish community, the Digbeth area, for example, that has been hugely gentrified now. It still has a kind of like a kind of reference point as being an Irish area, but now it's largely been, you know, gentrified in terms of that. The areas where Muslim populations live, in high deprivation areas, those are kind of remaining quite strong. They're not being regenerated, gentrified too greatly. But again, what we're seeing now is that, you know, in certain areas, that the kind of post-industrial areas within those kind of deprived areas are being kind of regenerated and kind of gentrified in there, and so you're kind of getting, you know, kind of gentrified communities being parachuted in. So I think that it is in that process of change. I think also as well, one of the interesting things is that there is also a kind of, you know, we've seen things such as white flight, you know, in you know, the urban areas, and I think that there's also been a case of a kind of Muslim flight as well. And so you see that some of the more affluent families increasingly moving out from that inner ring of poverty, but those areas still kind of keep that reputation as being the problematized Muslim areas in the city.
It's interesting, isn't it, when you talk about white flight, when you're mentioning there from areas that were mainly traditionally Irish areas in the past.
Yeah.
And of course, this idea which we've seen in the literature, and we talk about a lot, especially in the Irish context, about whiteness and the appropriation or the grasping onto whiteness, if you will, to sort of escape from that racialized position. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Kawtar, your work as well, again in this regard, is really, really fascinating, in the class element that came through. And I remember we spoke previously at a different forum about how, you know, people within, and Chris kind of touches on your point there, with the migration histories being different, of course, in different contexts. And we've spoken of the Danish, the French, the UK as well. With migration histories of Muslim communities in the Irish context, we have different class dynamics, and I've seen in my own field work a sort of an internalization of, you know, within Muslim communities of, this isn't the good place to go, and because it's maybe a working class area, maybe it's a deprived area, but at the same time seeing within those communities in those working class areas, perhaps without the data, hard to say, but maybe a greater welcoming or less racism maybe in that area, which brings it to your point, Kawtar, about the findings that you found in the French context of those how did you put it, those more privileged areas really, and the experiences of racism there.
Yeah, also in terms of gentrification, there is a clear link with urban Muslimness and urban Islamophobia, specifically for the French case, because their right to be visible in these areas, in these prestigious centers, is questioned. It's like being Muslim, being a visible Muslim is more difficult for them to access those prestigious areas and the Parisian center.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Salman, you made a point at the outset. And actually Ben picked up on the urban Muslimness and the positivity that can come with this sort of positive future coming through. You might have seen it in the comments there. The point of Muslimness and this sort of a protein is kind of the wrong word, but you know, something that is developing, something that's moving, something that is intangible, if you will. It speaks to an agency within Muslimness, within Muslim communities, and I'm just wondering how you contrast that with the essentialism in the sense of the racialization of Muslim communities, and that sort of the grappling within communities and that sort of dynamic of agency versus the racialized structure and what it brings on Muslimness.
I think that's really, really important point, and I'm not so sure it's a question, but it's a really important point,
Yeah,
James.
yeah,
I think
yeah.
no, but I think that's for me what defines the Muslim political right now. I mean, in a sense, is that is the entire struggle. So if you think about it, let's take these projects of securitization, which are predicated on racialization. And in a sense, what they do is that they create a condition where Muslims are suddenly recruited into being Muslims in a racialized way. And so for example, I mean, it's anecdotal evidence that I can, but I'm sure there are the data sets to demonstrate this if we were to be so positively inclined. But take, for example, people who were in the United States, Muslims who would never considered themselves to be subject to racism before the war on terror really set in. Yeah. And then they have cousins, they're in Harvard Law School. They feel, they've got a particular destiny, and then they have cousins who have been picked up by the FBI, and suddenly they're re-identifying themselves not with a kind of a hegemonic whiteness, but a kind of a counter-resistant blackness. Now, these are kind of, these small examples, but you can see what is happening. Or take the case what's happening in India. You simply see that kind of attempt at the racialization, which is trying to deprive the agency and the assertion of an agency. And in a sense, that's, I mean, in many cases like the Rohingya and, what's happening with Uyghurs or elsewhere, it has becoming either a existential struggle, in which case it is always going to be a political one, or close to an existential struggle, because either there is the notion that Muslims will disappear, like in the Rohingya, through ethnic cleansing, or what's happening, parts of Palestine and all these things, or they will cease to be Muslim in any meaningful way, so they will also disappear. So I think that the issue around racialization and agency and the question about Muslimness, in a way, is what I would like to ask, sort of question, sorry, it's a rhetorical thing, isn't it really fascinating that throughout the world, some of the most nationalistic, if you want to call it like that, projects, or the xenophobic nationalism, often finds expression through its hostility towards expressions of Muslimness. Whether it's Xi's China, or Modi's India, Macron's France, or Austria, or, whatever. I mean, and I think it's important that we include France and Austria in this equation of Islamophobic places, and just don't pretend that this happens there. And I think, and you have to ask yourself why that may be, and perhaps one of the elements is exactly that struggle for what it means to what is being racialized. And I think, and one of the biggest problems in the securitization discourse has been the inability of racial logics to contain Muslimness. If you remember, just after the 7/7 bombing in Britain, there was a period where everyone thought that because these people were carrying out were mainly predominantly from Kashmiri backgrounds, you had journalists being sent to Kashmir to find out what is it that makes these people behave this way. Then you have the aborted plan of bombing by a group of people from the Horn of Africa. And then it was, so what do Kashmiris and people from East Africa, the Horn of Africa, have in common? It must be poverty. So you have a class explanation going through there. And then you have the doctors in Glasgow or Australia, and they say, okay, so what is it the doctors and the poor from Kashmir have? You have this chain building up. Okay, it must be their men. And then you have the Muslim widows, the Chechen widows, the black widows, or female. So now you have men and women, uneducated, educated, doctors and not doctors, poor and rich, and you suddenly have this kind of, what is it that makes them common? And so all of the racial logics that you have to controlling that seems to keep seeping away. And that, I think, is exactly what is the Muslim condition or predicament or question, but also the possibility of building something new through that articulation and through that opportunity. But of course, that, hey, only God knows what will happen, but we have the opportunity to articulate these things in more hopeful directions rather than simply say there's nothing that can be done about it, because it also means that you can start having conversations which transcend those barriers to being able to think beyond the nation state, beyond the racial, beyond the class, between that, and that I think is really the possibility.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And it's, again, I think when we're doing our fieldwork with Muslim communities, certainly in the Irish context as well, that positivity, that optimism that we can see in terms of reformulations of Irishness, of what Irishness means, Irishness and Muslimness, the sort of nexus there, identifications of colonial past, colonial histories, the problems in there in terms of how these fit together or don't fit together and grate against each other and so on. Really fascinating. We're out of time, essentially. So it's we could go on for ages. We've had some fantastic questions and comments there that have been shared with us during the course of the evening. I guess at this point, what's left for me to do really is to start, I guess, by thanking my co-organisers, Dr Amina Easat-Daas, Dr Ben Whitham, and also Dr Irene Zempi. Of course, thanking you for your contributions as panelists today. It's been really wonderful to listen to you, to see the insights that you shared with us. Of course, I want to thank also to those who supported us. So the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre, the Department of Sociology and the University of Limerick, as you can see on screen, as being the supporters of the event. Now, there are two things that I just want to wrap up with very, very briefly. One piece relates to, there's a gallery event, in MK Gallery in Milton Keynes. This comic art is increasingly used by Muslim artists and those interested in the Muslim experience. There's an exhibition onto that theme, and the exhibition brings together comic book work by two Muslim artists, Tufix and Arakan Creative. It's also co-curated by or with Dr Amina Easat-Daas as part of a series of events exploring British Muslimness. So please do keep an eye out for that in the MK Gallery. And of course, we have our second of the Urban Muslimness series, which will be on this day week, same time. So please, if you haven't registered for it already, please do register. The link there has been shared as well to the MK Gallery event as well in the comments. So do please get along if you're in the area. Thank you very much. Sorry, Salman.
James, can I just say one thing very, very, very quickly? One plug there. There is going to be a conference on critical Muslim studies in September at the University of Leeds. So be there or be square.
Absolutely. I look forward to being there, I hope. Wonderful. Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your papers. Thanks for your contributions. Thanks for the comments. And thanks also to the people in DMU events for supporting the event. Thank you, and bye-bye.